There's a scene at the end of the first episode of Yokohama Shopping Log where our main character, the android Alpha, after being gifted a camera and deciding to go outside in search of the perfect photo, stands before a magnificent sunset, but finds herself unable to actually take the picture. She's so entranced, so immersed in the beauty of that present moment. But later she also remarks that she remembers the landscapes she saw that day a lot better than she usually does, despite not having been able to take any of the photos she originally intended to.
それに、今日の風景はいつもより鮮明に思い出せる。あの瞬間が蘇ってくる。
And that line in particular reminds me of a concept in literary theory known as defamiliarization. This notion was popularized by the Russian formalists, notably Viktor Shklovsky, and it serves as an explanation of the ultimate purpose of art. In his essay Art as Technique, Shklovsky writes, "If we start to examine the general laws of perception, we see that as perception becomes habitual, it becomes automatic. All of our habits retreat into the area of the unconsciously automatic. If one remembers the sensations of holding a pen or of speaking in a foreign language for the first time and compares that with his feeling at performing the action for the 10,000th time, he will agree with us. We apprehend objects only as shapes with imprecise extensions. We do not see them in their entirety, but rather recognize them by their main characteristics. We know what it is by its configuration, but we see only its silhouette. The object, perceived thus in the manner of prose perception, fades and does not leave even a first impression. Ultimately, even the essence of what it was is forgotten." He gives the example of a time he was cleaning his house and suddenly realized that he couldn't remember if he had already dusted one particular piece of furniture or not, because his movements had become so habitual and unconscious. He says that if some conscious person had been watching, then the fact could be established. If, however, no one was looking, or looking on unconsciously, if the whole complex lives of many people go on unconsciously, then such lives are as if they had never been. Art exists that one may recover the sensation of life. It exists to make one feel things, to make the stone stony. The purpose of art is to impart the sensation of things as they are perceived and not as they are known. And this is defamiliarization. And so, while searching for that perfect photo, Alpha unintentionally engages in a process of defamiliarization of her environment. These landscapes she sees all the time on her little trips across the countryside had receded to the back of her mind, and this artistic pursuit she's engaged in, photography, replaces her in the present moment and allows her to truly see what's around her, as if for the first time again. Alpha being a robot allows for many such moments throughout the series, of her being confronted with emotions that would generally be considered human. It's a good excuse to defamiliarize these basic human situations for the viewer, as in this scene where Alpha describes her tears and the feelings associated with crying.
なんだか涙が出てきた。本来、私の涙腺は瞳を潤すためだけのものなんだけど、こんなことは一人で月金を引いてる時なんかにはよくあった。それとは別の感じだけど、こういう気持ちも好きだな。
It's with this new perspective of an outsider to these human emotions that the viewer submits themselves to a defamiliarizing process that urges us to appreciate these little moments or sensations we take for granted. And I think that this ethos can be read into the Iyashikei genre in general. But perhaps one of the most blatant examples of defamiliarization in slice-of-life anime, and one that's become something of a meme almost, is Lucky Star's infamous dessert eating scene.
ねえつかさ、チョココロネってどこから食べる？頭からかな。そっか。ところでさ、頭ってどっち？太い方と細い方。私はこっちの細い方が頭だと思うんだけど。そっか、私は太った方が頭だと思ったよ。
According to Shklovsky, an important feature of defamiliarization is that it makes the familiar seem strange by describing it as if we were experiencing it for the first time. Now, he gives an example of a flogging scene from a Tolstoy story, but I think Lucky Star works just as well as an illustration of this concept. Shklovsky then elaborates on the various literary techniques that enable defamiliarization, citing the example of the parallelism. The perception of disharmony in a harmonious context is important in parallelism. The purpose of parallelism, like the general purpose of imagery, is to transfer the usual perception of an object into the sphere of new perception. In studying poetic speech in its phonetic and lexical structure, we find everywhere the artistic trademark. That is, we find material obviously created to remove the automatism of perception. The author's purpose is to create the vision which results from that de-automatized perception. Poetic techniques, such as the parallelism mentioned here, serve to constantly keep prosaic, ordinary language at bay, keeping us and our senses on our toes, so to speak. He goes on to say that the technique of art is to make objects unfamiliar, to increase the difficulty and length of perception, because the process of perception is an aesthetic end in itself and must be prolonged. A work is created artistically so that its perception is impeded and the greatest possible effect is produced through the slowness of the perception. So what this means is that for Shklovsky, this is what separates poetic language from ordinary language, or at least what should separate the two in good art. Our perception is toyed with, and it's this impeding of our perception, as he puts it, that is the ultimate aesthetic purpose of art, because it is what differentiates art from everything else, what differentiates art from the familiar. And of course, slice of life anime, especially those that are more focused on comedy, make ample use of such techniques, notably in their joke structure, playing around with length of perception, stretching or squeezing moments for comedic effect. These shows constantly seek to make the ordinary bizarre in some way, alien. These cute girls doing cute things anime are particularly efficient at plunging us deep into the supposedly ordinary, but then pulling us out of it through an absurd examination of these trivialities. Suddenly they don't seem so ordinary anymore. But something like Joshiraku goes a step further, tearing a topic apart until it loses its epistemic center, beyond simple defamiliarization towards a kind of disorientation. The original manga was written by Koji Kumeta of Sayonara Zetsubo Sensei fame, and details the lengthy conversations of 5 female rakugo performers. As is customary in Kumeta's work, these discussions start by establishing a topic, which is then walked through to its most absurd and illogical conclusion.
とにかく私は爪にひびが入るほどの乾燥肌なのよ。大変だね。いいなあ、キクちゃん持ち肌で。トントントン。乾燥肌、サメ肌、持ち肌、アメゴ肌、4人揃って肌アレンジャー。
But I mentioned Joshiraku mainly because the series also features a number of fourth wall breaks, which reminds me of the work of Bertolt Brecht, a German playwright and theorist who elaborated on the notion of defamiliarization in his epic theatre movement. With epic theatre, Brecht wished to distance himself from the theatrical naturalism popular at the time, where, according to him, the audience would hang up their brains with their hats in the cloakroom. He believed that realistic, immersive drama served to absorb the audience in the fictional world and make them forget about the real world. The spectacle, the melodrama, it was all just escapism in his view. This is where Brecht establishes his notion of Verfremdungseffekt, usually translated into English as the estrangement effect or distancing effect, which follows in the Russian formalist tradition of making strange, but goes even further, positing theatre as a political medium, where this defamiliarization, this estrangement, serves to get the audience thinking about the real world. And one of the techniques Brecht proposes to achieve this is characters directly addressing the audience. This was inspired by Brecht seeing a Beijing opera performance in Moscow in 1935, which he discusses in his essay Alienation Effects in Chinese Acting. He explains that he was impressed with the performances, playing in such a way that the audience was hindered from simply identifying itself with the characters in the play. Acceptance or rejection of their actions and utterances was meant to take place on a conscious plane instead of, as hitherto, in the audience's subconscious. And although Joshiraku is certainly not a political call to action, as with Kumita's other work, it certainly isn't devoid of social and cultural satire, and its twisty language games and fourth wall breaks force us to reconsider our grasp on certain concepts that we perhaps took for granted. And this process of knocking a concept off its axis through a lengthy process of deconstruction certainly has a defamiliarizing effect. And perhaps all of this is why the slice of life genre is so appealing to so many. Not simply because its mundane simplicity is relatable, but because it finds new ways to re-examine the mundane, awakening us from the trivial environment we find ourselves immersed in on a daily basis. Maybe this isn't so much the case nowadays, but there was certainly a time where these shows were derided for being aimless and meandering and completely devoid of plot or purpose. Shows about nothing, basically. But in fact, maybe there's an argument to be made that anime about cute girls doing cute things is actually one of the most essential genres, and in Shklovsky's view, closest to the fundamental purpose of art, which is to remind us of the beauty and poetry that can be found in all those things we take for granted.